Friends, it's indeed my great pleasure that in this video talk, I wish to take up the subject matter history, its idea and perception from ancient times till date, and in Indian context as well. I do understand that the idea and perception of history from ancient times till date has evolved and shaped by cultural, philosophical, and technological shifts. During ancient times, we find there's a tradition known as the oral traditions. In prehistoric and early civilizations, history was preserved through oral storytelling, myth, and legends. These often related with religious beliefs, origin, and purpose of life. Civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China recorded events on clay tablets, papyrus, or stone. Its focus was on rulers, wars, and divine intervention, emphasizing human interconnection with gods. Greek historians like Herodotus, often called the father of history, and Thucydides emphasize inquiry in shaping history. Romans like Livy and Tacitus chronicled events to celebrate Rome's achievements and moral lessons. In a way, history was a mix of factual reporting and moral storytelling. During the medieval period, we find a theological framework as history was often interpreted through a religious lens, especially in Europe and the Islamic world. Christian historians, for example, St. Augustine in his work The City of God, viewed history as linear, progressing toward divine fulfillment. Interestingly, we also find that Islamic scholars like the Khaduddin introduced sociology and economic factors into historical analysis, and his work was famously known as Muqaddimah. Then we find monasteries and Islamic scholars played key roles in preserving classical texts and historical records. We find chronicles, chronicles, annals, and genealogies focused on dynasties and religious events. Now we are heading towards Renaissance and Enlightenment. Now it is known as the 15th to 18th century. During this time, we find the rediscovery of classical texts. Renaissance revived interest in critical and secular perspectives on history. Scholars like Machiavelli, in his famous work, The Prince, examined power dynamics without divine justification. It's followed now scientific and rational analysis. Enlightenment or enlightened thinkers emphasized reason and evidence over tradition. Voltaire and Gibbon, in their work, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, critically focused on cultural and institutional factors. After this, it is followed the emergence of national histories. Histories were used to construct and legitimize national identities. Now let us come to the modern era, 19th to 20th century. During this period, we find that it is the professionalization of history. Historians like Leopold War Romatic emphasize empiricism and primary sources to make objective accounts. Archives and documentation became central to historical research. Marxist historians examined economics and class struggles as the basis and driver of history. In a way, it was, we may call it as a broader aspect of broader perspective of history. As social historians, they study the lives of ordinary people rather than just elites. Then we find this impact of technology. Now we find the photocopy, films, and later digital archives transformed how history was recorded and perceived. Now, in this another important contemporary area that is in the 21st century, we call it as a postmodernism and pluralism. We find challenges to the idea of a single objective history. We find emphasis on multiple perspectives and marginalized voices. For example, feminists, post colonial, we find the digital revolution, what we call the internet and digital tools had demonstrated access to historical information and analogies. Interestingly, social media and public history projects allow more people to contribute to historical narratives. Now, we let us see at the global and the environmental histories. There's a focus on interconnected global histories over the impact of human activity on the planet. Now, this is a latest concept of what we call it Anthropocene. Let us see the recurring themes of perception of history in the general context. The bases are number one, history as a tool used for education, identity building, and moral lessons. Two, cyclical versus linear views. Some cultures see history as repetitive cycles, other as progressive. Some view it as there is a subjectivity element in history, and it is shaped by the concept who tells the story and why. As such, it may be stated generally that from ancient myths, storytelling, to modern digital archives, the perception of history continue to evolve, reflecting perception changing priorities and technological advancement. After this, let us see how the idea of history and perception in the Indian context. In the Indian context, we find it has undergone a significant evolution over millenniums. It is shaped by cultural, philosophical, and political developments. In ancient India, the perception of history it was closely tied to mythology, religion, and philosophy rather than being seen as a linear or factual record. Following this, we can see that history was perceived as cyclical, influenced by the concepts of karma and reincarnation, with time divided into cosmic ages known as yugas. And the key developments here we find the mythological narratives. Texts like Mahabharata and Ramayana mix history with mythology, focusing on dharma, righteousness, and societal ideals. We find Vedic literature, the Vedas, through primarily religious texts, contain references to migration, wars, the famous the Battle of Ten Kings, and societal structures. Now, historical chronicles, early records like the Puranas attempted to document dynasties and genealogies, blending cosmic events with human history. We have a secular accounts at the same time in the ancient time. Works like Kautilya's Arthashastra, 4th century BCE, documented statecraft, economics, and governance, providing a pragmatic view of history. During the Mauryan and the Gupta periods, history began to be used to legitimize rule and highlight the achievements of empires, but it's still often carried moral and religious overtones. The key developments in this period we find Ashokan edicts. Ashoka, 3rd century BC, recorded his policies and Buddhist ideals on rock and pillar inscriptions, offering one of India's earliest historical document. We find court history as well. Texts like Kalidas Raghuvanshara celebrated the glory of rulers, blending history with literary embellishment. Then astronomical records, scholars like Aryabhat and Vasimaraha incorporated historical data and, and their studies of astronomy and chronological order. During the medieval period, we saw the shift toward Islamic and religious historiography with a focus on rulers, conquests, and governance. History was often recorded as a means of glorifying dynasties or documenting religion and cultural practices. The developments we find in the Islamic historiography chronicles like Al-Buruni, Tariq al-Hind in his work, and Ziauddin Baruni, Tariq-e Firoz Shahi introduced analytical and empirical approaches offering insights into Indian society, culture, and politics. We find regional history also during this period. Local rulers commissioned histories as vernacular languages in vernacular languages, focusing on specific kingdoms and cultural achievements. For example, Tamil Sangam literature, Bhakti and Sufi movements, historical records began to reflect the growing influence of devotional movements emphasizing spiritual and cultural transformation. During the colonial period, that is 18th to 20th century, the British colonial system and administration reshaped the perception of Indian history, emphasizing a on Eurocentric view and dividing it into Hindu, Muslim, and British periods. This period saw both the historian, both the histories and the revival of Indian historical consciousness. The key development we find during this period is we find the emphasis on Orientalism. Scholars like William Jones and James Mill studied Indian history, often misinterpreting through Western lens, portraying India as stagnant and in need of reform. We find now the nationalist historiography, Indian historians like R.C. Majumdar, they sought to reclaim India's past, focusing on its cultural and scientific achievements to inspire the to inspire the anti-colonial sentiment. Archaeological discoveries, excavations of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro in 1920s revealed the advanced Indus Valley civilization challenging the colonial narrative of Indian backwardness. The post-independence India 1947 onwards we find the perception of history after independence. Indian history became a tool of formation or for nation building with efforts to present as unified secular narrative that celebrated diversity. The key development we find the nationalist narratives, the early post-independence period emphasize syncretic traditions and the contributions of all communities to Indian history. Marxist historiography historians like D.D. Koshabi and Irfan Habib analyzed Indian history through the lens of class, caste, and material conditions, shifting focus to the lives of ordinary people. We find original or regional histories, increasing recognition of the histories of marginalized communities and regional cultures and women. We find later at recently hinted or a revivalism. In recent decades, there has been a push to reinterpret Indian history from a Hindu nationalist perspective, emphasizing ancient Hindu achievements that often downplaying contributions of Muslim rulers. digital and public library, advancement or advance in technology, and has documented history with the digital archives, documentaries, and social media platform focusing on fostering public engagement. Let us see the recurring themes in the Indian historical perception. First is cyclicality versus linearity. Ancient Indian history viewed time as cyclical, while modern historiography adopted linear or progressive framework. Second, unity in diversity. Indian history has consistently reflected the interplay of diverse cultures, religions, and languages. Struggle for identity. Next, from colonial interpretation to nationalist narratives, history has been a battleground for defining Indian identity. Interdisciplinary approach. Indian historiography has always integrated literature, archaeology, religion, and science to construct a multifaceted view of the past. So, in a way, in conclusion, it may be stated that Indian history and its perception remain dynamic, reflecting the evolving priorities and challenges of each era while maintaining a deep connection to its cultural and philosophical roots. Thank you very, very much.